You're currently doing business in China. We're told about 5% of global revenues in China. How fast do you plan to grow that?
We've been growing about 20% year over year for the last 3 to 4 years. The market grows roughly about that, 15 to 20% in IT and software. We expect to continue the 20% growth.
Every year?
Every year.
What are some new, how has the doing business in China changed, let's say, over the last few months? There's all sorts of myths about it, but describe from your point of view what the biggest change is.
That's a loaded question, but I'll try to summarize it. I think why don't we start with the SCND, just happened in Washington, D.C. between all the trade people of the two countries. I think if you hear what they worked on in the last couple of days, they worked on indigenous innovation. That implied to whether the market is transparent enough for us to participate, like the U.S. market. Like the U.S. company. You talk about procurement, because China today still have not signed the Government Procurement Act under the WTO, although technically they're not violating anything, but we would love to see that happen so that we can facilitate more trade into China. So they worked on that, and they worked on the fact that the market is there's something called the Article 9, which is there's a differentiation between buying from the Chinese government buying from the China produced production versus foreign, but they Premier Wen Jiabao and President Hu Jintao numerous times publicly has said that they will not differentiate between whether this is a U.S. made or European made or China made, and as long as it has an established operation in China, they will view it as an all-local company. Those are the three things. I think the investment area is also going to be very interesting. There is no bilateral investment treaty between the two countries, so they're making investment in China a little bit more difficult, a lot more red tape, and I think that's the major change. I was going to
say there's a lot of discussions and promises being made, but do you see any real changes?
To be honest, haven't yet. These discussions have been ongoing for the last couple of years. If you couple it with the intellectual property rights issue, that's probably have been a 10-year conversation. It's been improving, but very, very slow. My understanding is that this is hot off the press news. There's an organization called BSA, and they have a report today that's going to release that's shown that some incremental improvement of intellectual property protections in China, but really we're talking like very, very small incremental improvement, and so there's still a lot of work to do, and there's still a lot of challenges.
And this is a particularly tough issue for you in your software development business.
Very much so, very much so. I think to me the bigger issue IPR no doubt is a huge issue because we lose us money on it. The bigger issue is whether we have all the right opportunities open to us in China, and because there's a growing market, a lot of internal demand, and we wanted to have a level playing field, a fair way to compete.
And it's not?
We don't believe so. It feels a little different. We hire all local Chinese. We don't have expatriate going there running the operations. We're fortunate enough to have some good partnerships early on with the Ministry of Science and Technology, for example, and the universities over there. So we're actually a well-accepted brand over there. But I still wanted to see us being able to get into more of the government-driven huge projects, and we like the opportunity.
You said that it costs you money. How much?
It is hard to predict. Hard to calculate that. I'm free to, I guess fair to say a reasonably substantial amount, because if you think about it, if the privating percentage, whatever it is, about, let's call it 90% as a round figure. So every 100 copy being used, I only got paid 10. Now the market pricing is a little different over there. You can't expect the same as a developed market pricing, but so it's still substantial. It is some meaningful number. As I said, what would have happened is it would have been growing, and because the market is growing so fast and the demand is so huge that it doesn't feel as much pain. Now, if it goes the other way, then of course we're going to see a lot of different results.
Yeah, I want to ask you about the macroeconomic picture in China. Do you see risks right now?
Yes, I think the latest things, everybody, you follow China a lot, and inflation is a huge concern. They've been doing a lot of good short-term monetary controls process to discourage the runaway economy, or to at least to put a cap on it. So I think that's a big risk. I think inflation, overheated economy is a huge risk.
And do you see that working on the ground, having business there? Do you feel that?
You do. I think the China policy, the good thing about China policy is it reacts very quickly. The bad thing about China policy, it comes very, very strong and sharp. So, deals could be pushed out, delayed, discussion could be put on hold, quote unquote, sometimes it could be indefinitely, sometimes will come right back. There's a level of choppiness over there with that. We do see it, we do feel it.
Do you see the super fast growth as a problem? You mentioned the overheating risk. There are other risks that come with that. Bubbles, the property market is an issue. How do you view this?
Property bubble, I think let's call it more like adjustment. I think their bubble is a little different than our bubble. Their government, because of the way it is a centrally planned economy, their government would not let the bubble really burst the way that we see it in America. And even in America, we're trying to manage the soft landing of that. Whether it's debatable whether we're doing it better or not. But their policy is a lot faster. They could implement it a lot more across the board. So I think the housing, so-called housing bubble, certainly very high. A lot of time you're high in relative to what? Beijing is very high, Shanghai is very high, but so is Hong Kong, but it's still growing. Now, that doesn't mean it won't hit a bubble, and it will hit a bubble, Hong Kong especially so. But Tokyo has been high historically, and so is London, and so is New York. So I think it's really more about opportunity rather than looking at the bubble. If you ask me, is there going to be adjustment to that? Absolutely, there's going to be adjustment to that. I still come back to the fact that I think the inflation is a big issue. I think there's also social issues brewing over there. There are two parts of it. One is the have and have-nots. I mean, the gaps are humongous, huge. In the past 20 years or 30 years, they've been building the middle class, which is great because it's it's more inclusive in that sense. But some of the classes are now super rich class. And then, unfortunately, there's still a lot of challenges with the poverty people. So I think that's going to be the biggest tension.
The wealth gap.
Yeah, the wealth gap is one of the huge. The other one is, not everybody got great jobs. There's a promise of you study well, you go to universities. Universities are education is your rights, and they were going to be very promoting education. But when they come out of universities, they might not necessarily get the kind of job that they imagined they would, and so that's going to be another challenge. It's not so much as the unemployment, is whether you're properly employed.
And as a business leader, as a CEO doing business, how do you hedge yourself for these risks, or how do you prepare for the risks, the wealth gap, the employment problems, the social issues?
You really couldn't. Not as a private, not as a company. It's not from a private sector, so to speak. You need to work more closely with the government sectors. That's why doing business in anywhere, in fact, not just in China, you do have to have some interaction and helping the governments, encourage them to set the right policy to encourage more open growth, transparent growth, and you hope for the best, and I believe economy adjust themselves over time, and the policy is really what makes a difference. So if you could help set the policy, focus on growth with the public-private sectors cooperations, I think it'll work. I mean, we've been doing that in the United States for many years.
On a scale of 1 to 10, how open to growth and to private investment and to U.S. China company sharing is the government at this point?
In terms of their influence?
Right.
Well, the influence, let me answer the question this way. The government influence, both governments now, we're talking about both Washington and Beijing now, the government influence is huge. It's probably 9 out of 10. Because there's a lot of restriction and all the policy. Now, as far as where we are in openness, 3, 2, it's certainly sub 5.
The joint relationship.
In a joint relationship, both sides, by the way. And we know that you obviously know we have a CFIUS filing process in the United States. When a Chinese company wants to go global and wants to come to the United States and invest, we do have a lot of processes, and I'm not going to comment on whether that's good, bad, or indifferent, but we do make people go through a lot of steps. Some probably are right. Most I don't think is necessary. But that's a different issue. Vice versa. The Chinese is emulating the same thing. They are now putting in all that national security concerns and all these compliance. And
are you talking about protectionism?
Yes, yes, it is. It is protecting. Both countries are somewhat protecting their infrastructure and their economic structures. I don't think that's wise, but that's a business person talking. I'm not running government. I'm not in government, and I probably aren't qualified to comment on it. But I do believe that is pushing ourselves that way.
The last question is on internet use in China. This is important for your company. Much of the population is restricted. This is a problem.
Restricted in terms of accessing internet?
Access.
Well, they're not really restricted in accessing internet. Is what information do you allow to see on the internet? For business people, see, I'm in business software. It doesn't affect me as much because broadband and wireless broadband infrastructure is much better in China than it is in the United States. So there are more people actually gaining to that, getting to the broadband and being able to get on the internet. If I go to the cloud computing world and try to sell that to people and get users to use it in China, I don't have that limitation on infrastructure. So it doesn't affect me as much. What it does affect me, which go back to your previous question, was do I have the rights to distribute these data, even if it's not political sensitive data? The answer is no, because they protect the telecom license. And so you have to work with a local company, a local telecom company, so you could get the license so that you could put your software on the cloud so that people could go to the cloud and then you could do business.
Which makes it even harder for you because of the enormous opportunity, because their broadband capability is so much more advanced.
It's harder, may not be the right word, it's a little bit more frustrating. Frustrating is probably the better word.